Well, I don't think anybody can claim to be an expert in Portia Geach. I do have a little background in 19th century women artists because some 15 years ago I was fortunate enough to discover the paintings of my grandfather's sister, Sophie Stefanoni, who was born in the same year as Portia Geach, 1873. I was helping to clear out the laundry of my grandparents' home after they both passed away, and this of course led me into the investigation of the life of this artist, and much of what I discovered about the difficulties faced by 19th century women artists of course applies to Portia Geach. As I was involved in my research, a well-known gentleman whom I won't name in the art world said to me, if these women had been any good, we would know who they are. But as Jan Roberts, in her book on the Astor building in Quarry Street, who I've drawn heavily on, said her paintings are everywhere but nowhere, certainly not available for the art-loving public in Sydney or Melbourne to assess them, because her work was never acquired by the New South Wales or Victorian state galleries. Now, not being collectible meant being left out of art history books, and in reality she sank without a trace. Portia Geach, sadly, may only be remembered as an artist because of her sister's establishment of this portrait prize in her name. You can't resurrect the career of a woman artist. You can only hope to then write them into anything that comes from now on, right? You can't go back and change the society that they were living in, the fact that they weren't treated as professionals by men artists, etc., etc. You just can't resurrect a whole career. But from now on, as somebody mentioned today, she is being written into the art history books, so hopefully she will now have a place where she should have had a place, put it that way. Now, Portia Geach was born in 1873, the same year, as I said, as my artist, the fifth child of six. The family was originally from Cornwall. Father Edmund was a warehouseman, later a draper, who made his fortune from property, mostly in Melbourne. They owned and sold the old Prince Edward Theatre, and also in rural Victoria. Her mother, Catherine, sometimes listed as being a writer. There's no record of Portia's early education, but the family were wealthy enough to have a governess for the four surviving Geach daughters. Portia, the youngest, studied design and painting at the National Gallery School in Victoria from 1890 to 96, winning second prize for painting from the nude in 1895. Director Bernard Hall had his view that his women graduates were the best trained in Australia, validated when Portia won the first travelling scholarship given to an Australian to study at the Royal Academy in London. That same year, Portia with her sister Lyndall were written up in the papers for riding through the Gippsland wilds on cavalier in national costume. Such reckless and unladylike behaviour. Did that mean they rode in horseman fashion rather than side saddle, and perhaps wore bushman's clothing? Who knows? From 1897 to 1900, she was with the Royal Academy in London, studying under John Singer Sargent and other visiting masters. In Paris, she reputedly studied with Whistler. By 1901, she was back in Melbourne and opened a studio on Collins Street, held an exhibition of her work and became a member of the Victorian Artists Society, where she exhibited regularly from then on. In 1904, the family moved to Sydney and she divided her time between Sydney and Melbourne. In 1906, she began exhibiting with Sydney's Royal Art Society, and in the Women's Work exhibition in Melbourne in 1907, she won second prize. No first prize was awarded, perhaps they were cost-cutting, for watercolour figure painting with a work called Procession of Horses. And this is interesting because it was priced at 50 guineas. The average workman's wage, I think, was something like £2.10 or something, so that was a very substantial price. And she also won second prize for etching. She lived as a professional artist from then on, travelling constantly between Australia, Europe and the US. She was described as a well-seasoned traveller who divides her year by continents. In 1922 she moved into the Astor building in Macquarie Street, which was a serviced apartment, and she had extra windows built in her bedroom for a studio. Portia really had two separate lives in many respects. She was an active feminist all her life and began working with the Boys and Girls Clubs in Melbourne when a teenager. She painted a suffragist banner for Vida Goldstein in 1905. In 1904, the Child Study and Health Association of Australia was formed to develop children through nutrition. Portia Geach was a member of the executive committee for many years, and I'm sure if she was alive today, she'd no doubt be active on the problem of childhood obesity. That was the sort of cause that she would be involved in. Had a very strong personality and was a force for justice and fair dealing, one of the foremost fighters of her era for better conditions for women in the home. In 1917, she attended a meeting of the Housewives Association in New York and became convinced that a similar organisation was necessary for Australia, founding the New South Wales Housewives Association on her return. At its peak in 1935, it was a statewide lobby group with 15,000 financial members, united with a national and international body of 4 million women. And I have here too a copy of the letter from Portia Geach to Rose Scott, which talks about her idea for liaising with the Americans. She'd been to a conference with 1,000 delegates in the US, and put the question, you know, was it possible that they could form something to involve Australian women? She tirelessly campaigned for the rest of her life for women's rights to equal pay, the right to hold public office. Her weekly radio program on 2FC educated women in the principles of proper nutrition. She was a precursor of the ACCC, bringing in the stamping of land and the sizing of eggs. The margarine versus butter controversy split the organisation, as she was accused of taking bribes by her most active opponent, Mrs Woodward, and she and 4 others were expelled. Woodward is quoted in the Herald in 1959. What would Miss Geach know about keeping a house? She's only lived in a flat, a serviced one at that. She couldn't even boil an egg without burning it. The association now is nothing more than a Portia Geach Admiration Society. She didn't mention that Portia Geach always employed a female chauffeur to drive her around in a big Buick as well.
Well, I suppose the very first thing most people like to know about portraiture is, even today I was asked this simple question, is why you choose the subject in the first place. And there's usually a catalyst for this sort of thing. It doesn't just, you just don't pick somebody out of a sort of yellow, the phone book or anything like that. This time, my husband gave me this book a couple of years ago. I found it in a second-hand bookshop, and we were always scouting around bookshops. And because I was interested in flying, I've always wanted to fly. But reading this book, particularly when Nancy was speaking about her first flight, when she was going out on the Gypsy Moth, and her lessons that she had with Kingsford Smith, it was the most extraordinary experience. I could almost feel myself in the cockpit with her. And I was lucky enough earlier this year to go in a Tiger Moth as a passenger, but I was sitting in the front seat of this Tiger Moth, totally open air. It's a wonderful old plane, and he took me on this fantastic trip around Whitsundays, and I don't think you could actually be in a better place. But we did all the aerobatics and spinning coming down. I was a bit green afterwards, but it was very adorable. So having read this book, I had to know more about this person, even though it's you don't always get the chance to read about someone's life as much as this before you begin a portrait. But it was definitely an inspiration. Her passion was an inspiration. Her life was incredibly interesting. And so it was a simple phone call. I went to visit Nancy, and she was delighted. I suppose it's quite an interesting thing to do if you're not involved in the art world, to be part of this. I don't think I'd like to be on the other side of it myself, but it was, I was very pleased and grateful that she would sit and spare some time. Because portraiture can't be done on your own. You really need the subject. And I suppose, unlike many my other work or most other painters who are, you're stuck in the studio, you're isolated from the rest of the world, sometimes months on end. They very rarely let you out, and when you do, you probably make a fool of yourself. But in a situation where you're painting portrait, you have a chance to have one-on-one with somebody over a period of time, and a license to stare at them, a license to probe. I mean, you don't always get that chance, and it's the most rewarding experience. The other part about painting, in painting the portrait, is not just the art of the subject you have to be involved with, but it's also a collaboration between the artist and the paint, because you never really know where that's going. So you're on this journey where there are no directions, there's no one telling you where to go, and often you don't know where you're going to find yourself. It is an exploration. And over a period of time, painting many portraits, probably in the last 10 years, I've focused on people, although all my life I look back at my sketchbooks, and and even my very early work when I was about 12 to 16, there have always been people, and I think, oh my God, I'm still painting faces, I'm still painting people, without realising, with all of my other work, with the landscapes and things, there's always been a focal point with people.
First of all, thank you all for coming out today in this threatened storm, because although it was a beautiful morning, the forecast was for rain this afternoon. But of course, we're also thrilled to have it rain, aren't we? Yeah. You know, we really, if anybody says it's a bad rocky day, terrible weather, I say to them, what? It's raining, it's wonderful weather. But what I should talk to you about, the artists who have the perseverance to paint me, and I'm very thrilled with her work. When she first asked me, I was a little bit, I thought, goodness me, why does she want to paint me? And so I said, you know, I feel that, you know, I'm getting too old to be painted. And I said to my daughter, who knows a little bit about art, Danielle wants to paint me. Oh, she said, she's a great artist. She did the best portrait in the art world this year in Margaret Holly. So I was very flattered then, and said so to Danielle, and we fitted it in, and believe me, it was fitting it in, because she was a very busy person, and I had taken on a busy program that I felt that I got to an age where I'd accept everything and try and, you know, you go like a bulldozer, don't you, at things and get through them, because you wonder if it's going to be the last time you have the chance. So what I'd like to talk to you about today really isn't, because I don't know a great deal about art. When I was out at birth, art was never further from my mind, or the privileges in those days, but I did know Portia Geach. I knew her because when I came to the city, a group of women, led by Jessie Street and Mrs. Keithley, Jean Arnold, and a few very distinguished women like that, used to have an organisation, and I think they wanted to see what this bit of a kid was doing out west flying. And of course, in those days, although Amy Johnson and Jean Batten flew into Sydney and you heard a lot about them, when you were flying back and beyond, they didn't send people out there to find out what you were doing. But I had started flying, and I was still 17 years of age, although I was 18 at the end of that year, and it had been my ambition to fly since I was quite a small child. In fact, I think I was probably got the inspiration from the conversation of the adults in the 1919 air race, when that airplane started out with Ross and Keith Smith from England to Australia. A lot of people predicted it would never get here, that the race would never terminate in Sydney. In fact, Billy Hughes, who put up the £10,000 prize for the race, even sent the HMA of Sydney up to Darwin in case they ended up in the water between Timor and Darwin. And I know my father would have predicted they'd never get to Karachi, and others predicted they'd never get to cross France and so on. But anyhow, the excitement of their dance was such that as a small child, 4 years of age, apparently, I went out and climbed the fence and jumped off and called myself an epiplane. And how would a 4-year child know anything about flying, except that my mother told me that, and I have no reason to disbelieve it.
Yes, I think the challenges are there to definitely sort of overcome, and yeah, there's just, I think I've come from a very strong line of women, and there were no boundaries, no ceilings, just, you know, no problems, just solutions. I don't think it was ever a decision that I wanted to be an artist. I think I just grew up with a pencil in my hand. I know that sounds like a terrible cliche. I know, sorry.
No,
but it's true. My mother, my family was just my mother, my sister, and I most of the time. Our lounge room was our studio. In the weekends, we would have 3 easels up, and the 3 of us would be painting. I had the most wonderful childhood, really enjoyable, just so supportive. But I went into teaching. Rather than pursue just the arts. I think that was also my mother was saying, you know, you've really got to have this education, so a degree is what you need. And I loved teaching too, I must say. I did love teaching. I loved the children, the high school children, I can't really call them children, can they? Young adults. And then the tertiary education, the imparting, because I got so much from them as well. But then they got to a point where there was too much giving, perhaps, or I had less time for my own work, and I guess I was teaching. I had 2 children, a husband, and I'd paint at night from between the hours of 11 o'clock and 3 in the morning. You know, you can only sustain that for a certain amount of time. Something had to go. So the first thing I think was the husband. The second was the job. Sorry, I know that sounds terrible. But eventually, I'm just painting full time, and I have done now for probably 15 years. But it's a hard juggle. Obviously, different worlds, like it's different to everywhere. Everybody's studios are like a little womb, I suppose. Very private, very personal. And it takes a while to develop the space that you want to work in. Last year, I actually had a studio. Well, I don't know if I can tell you the story. I did a commission at the Northern Territory for the Supreme Courts. And I was painting it was for the centenary of the courts there, and I was painting the Chief Justices for the Supreme Court. And I had trouble trying to find a studio, and originally they found one which is not much bigger than a laundry with 5-foot walls in it, and I thought, my God, I couldn't fit a judge in here. I mean, my painting's here, let alone a judge. So eventually they found me a space which was the gym in the actual Supreme Court. And because I work, once I start work, there is no hours or limits. I tend to work I just keep going. It's just, there's no stopping. I mean, you sleep and eat whenever you feel hungry, you're tired, so you can be working through 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. It didn't really matter. But at least it was access to the judges, access to the courts. And yeah, I loved that studio, and I took over their gym. I really just completely annihilated the gymnasium. So you can make your space out of anything. It was a fantastic experience and a wonderful learning experience. Like every portrait you do is a real learning experience. You can draw so much from people's lives, and you can gain so much. It's a solitary occupation. Portraiture is not. Because you're involving this other person into your studio, into the womb. It's you can't work on your own. You can't work without the subject. Although of course when they've gone, you continue working. The painting begins in your mind, and it doesn't stop. When I work, I don't know how other people work, but when I'm working with a subject, that becomes my life. I dream about them. I suppose I've often said I sleep with them, and I sleep with them by dreams. I think about it that way. But everything about them becomes part of my life for that period of time. And of course, once that's finished, you give birth to the painting, and I hope for the best, really. That's it. And I love drums. I play the dashboard. But I was investigated and became enamoured with a drummer from Senegal, and he played the talking drums, and I asked him whether he would play and I could paint him. So he came to the studio, and he played most beautifully, and he expressed and he tried to teach me the language of the talking drum. So I was in my studio, huge space, empty sort of barn type space. He was there playing. I had the drawings and canvases, or basically blank paper, and I would just watch, and I'd stare and I'd absorb. And after about 10 minutes, he says, can I see? Or I said, well, no, I haven't done anything yet. And eventually he got the idea that he wasn't allowed to look at my work until I finished. And when I had finished a series of work, because every portrait is a series of works, he looked at them, and the focus for me was on his hands, and perhaps part of his face. This is Malik, the king of the talking drums. And, he said, where is the rest of me? And he was so disappointed, and I'm thinking, oh, God, sorry. But you have to do what you want to do. You don't want to be influenced by anybody's, any comments, whether they be positive or negative, because they can send you off in the wrong tangent. If somebody saw them, they liked or disliked it, particularly they liked, think, my God, that was the part I hated. Then you start to reconsider. And there was another portrait I did where I became influenced by what he really wanted in the portrait. I've never liked that portrait, but I finished it. But I've always used that to remind myself to stay true to my own aims or my own feelings about what I want to achieve, regardless of what the result's going to be or the expectations of the sitter. And I try to explain that to everyone who agrees to sit with me, and that's why I think they're very, very, brave. It's a very brave thing to do.